Now, another key component to understand, and we're returning to another concept which we've talked about before, and that is cognition and the cognitive component or the cognitive influence that comes into play on conditioning itself. And uh, the the thing that we have discovered is that for many animals, cognitive appraisals are important for learning. Cognitive. So there's some uh, rudimentary level of cognition, thought, if you will, that lead to the kinds of learning that they display. And learning is displayed by a change in behavior that's relatively permanent. And that this cognitive appraisal is essentially the animal in this case is sizing up what the next level or the next choice there is to make, and it displays a cognitive learning that goes on. Rats have been um, it's been demonstrated that they can learn a map of a maze and get through it faster and faster, according to the conditioning um, that they've learned as a result of the primary conditioner or the reinforcer in food as well. The rats seem to develop a mental representation, and the concept here is something that we refer to as a cognitive map that they develop of a maze, even in the absence of getting any reward. And so there, what we refer to as latent learning occurs, and they display a speediness that betrays just reinforcement alone. Um, and it shows up only when there's some reinforcement or some incentive that will bring that latent learning out. In other words, as they're going through the maze, they are figuring out the basic components of that maze um, in terms of how to get to a desired end. And they develop the map as to where the food is and race through this maze a lot faster than one would expect, just because of the reinforcement, which betrays what we refer to as latent learning. In other words, they're learning something that is not obvious. We don't see it immediately. Um, Another aspect here is that research suggests that people may come to see rewards rather than the intrinsic interest as motivation for performing a task. So what comes into play is something where we make the distinction between of intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. And extrinsic. And intrinsic is you do it just for the love of doing it, the desire to perform a behavior effectively for its own sake. So intrinsic is that it is the behavior itself is inherently reinforcing. It doesn't really need to be reinforced. Um, Sorry. It doesn't need to be externally reinforced. In other words, the organism is actually reinforcing itself just by doing it. And there are some things that you do, I'm sure, that are probably intrinsically motivating. For example, reading. There's certain things that you probably like to read, and nobody really has to dangle a reward out in front of you. You do it because you just simply like to do it. Extrinsic, on the other hand, is motivation that is really bound to the incentive or the reinforcer, if you will. So there are some things, like in college, for example, that you will read only because there is some reward for it, and that's it. And once the reward is removed, then essentially you won't read it. and that so the incentive in this case is external, and once it's removed, then it's not reinforcing any longer. So the key component when we're talking about cognitive influences is the cognitive appraisal that's being made, and the aspect of cognitive map and latent learning, which becomes evident really only when there is an incentive and that demonstrates the extra learning that the organism has done. And then the other concept is intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic being desiring to perform a behavior effectively and for its own sake. In other words, the rewards carry hidden reinforcement to it. Extrinsic, on the other hand, is you do it because of an extrinsic external reward, and that really is about it.